I've observed that companies really like to hire people with experience in respective verticals, such as oil and gas, marine, medical, or FMCG. How could you go about it and change a vertical if you've worked 10 or 15 years or more in a specific one?
Yeah, that's a tough question because it depends on what that vertical is what I would say. There have been successes in moving into alternative energy from oil and gas specific. I've also seen people move successfully. So for instance, if you're in the manufacturing sector within energy, oil and gas, you can typically move into another industrial manufacturing or specific manufacturer outside of oil and gas. But if you're talking about changing a specific function, that's harder. If you are in a finance role or a safety role, some of these functional roles, those are also easier to translate specifically if, so for instance, we were looking at a finance role recently, and we had the particular company is very project focused in the midstream space, let's say. And so they're providing services to midstream. They don't, in a functional role, they don't really care whether a finance person has midstream experience or automotive experience or whatever experience they may have. What they care about is whether they have project experience. Have they been involved with a company that is focused on projects and services and resourcing rather than manufacturing or whatever it might be. So those are things that you can change. When you think about, so I'm thinking a specific vertical, if maybe you're talking about, let's say, geoscience, right? If you're in geoscience and you've been working for an operator in exploration, maybe you're an interpreter, a geophysicist, how can you translate that to something else? It's going to be more difficult, but there are a few industries that could go, if you're looking at the alternative energy route, you could be looking at geothermal. There are companies that are interpreting the seabed floor for new wave technology. There are other things you can look at. So the environmental aspect of that is maybe a way you could shift, but it's going to be much more difficult than a finance person changing industry. It just depends on what that specific vertical is. I can help with that, but it's not always easy depending on what your specific skill set is.
Okay. Another one from Charek. As I understand, leadership style that companies look for during COVID period is a compassionate, integrative, participative style rather than a strong military style. That is sometimes associated with acting quickly, cutting costs, making redundancies. But in your experience, is it majority of companies that have this first style in top 3 requirements from a candidate, or is it emerging trend, but not yet in majority?
So I think that's a good question. I'm not sure that it's as simple as what you're suggesting, that it's important or not important. I think what we have to understand is that having an empowering leadership style doesn't mean that you still don't have to make some really hard choices, and you're ultimately going to have to make some cuts that you might not want to. So you still have to make the hard decisions, you still have to be decisive, and that doesn't mean you can always go with a consensus or involve your entire team. I think what we need to remember is in COVID and beyond, in any adverse crisis situation, a leader has to be decisive and has to make hard decisions. But that doesn't necessarily reflect a directive style. It means they've got to make the decisions, they're the leader, but you can still have an empowering leadership style that brings the rest of your workforce along. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Okay, next one from Matt. Houston seems to be making strategic push to retain energy capital of the world and stay relevant with energy transition. There are examples of cities where it didn't work that well. For example, Aberdeen. Do you see any initiatives in the city that are targeted at oil and gas professionals to stay in the city and be part of that change?
Ooh, I don't see any initiatives myself. If you know some, Matt, it'd be good to hear. But what I would say is there's a big difference between Houston and Aberdeen. Aberdeen was the big oil and gas capital because of the North Sea and because of their technology advancements in subsea over the years. They were doing things in harsh conditions, and that was being adapted to the rest of the oil and gas industry. And they do have initiatives in Scotland and in the UK to keep it an oil and gas hub, but more from a technology standpoint, they're shifting and changing, not because of what's happening in the North Sea. Well, they have to because they're decommissioning in the North Sea, but because they're trying to turn it into that technology hub. And so they've got the Oil and Gas Technology Center and some other things. In Houston, we definitely still have technology advancements, but I think we've always had that. So when you look at Houston as an oil and gas capital of the world, it is because of the number of independent oil companies that are here working all over the world, which is a little different than Aberdeen. And because of the oil and gas and energy infrastructure for the US is much greater. So while we're serving ourselves domestically and made that switch to being independent if we need to, that is helpful. And then also we're serving the rest of the world. And so we're already an established hub. I think it's going to be hard to take that title away from us. The other place that seems to do it is in the Middle East, and Saudi's trying to become a new capital. And they're doing a pretty good job of bringing a lot there, but that's just because they're the largest oil producer in the world. But if you know of some initiatives to keep talent here, I think that's good, because the problem we do have is that so much talent has been let go or has left the oil and gas industry that as the industry ramps back up, there will not be enough talent. We're going to have to bring it back in. So there's definitely a concern about talent retention in the energy industry and in Houston, for sure.
Okay, talking about talent, Mary, we have students from A&M and other universities on the line.
Yes.
What advice do you have for these students? Is energy and oil and gas in specific a good space to enter now? And how to manage your early career now to be set up for a success?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's not an easy one to answer, but we've seen these spikes go up and down over the years, right? And at the same time, we've seen university students changing their majors as those ups and downs go. The trick is you can't always time those ups and downs because of the nature of the energy industry. So it's probably good to get used to them now. But what I will say is I wouldn't give up on that. If you've gone in and you've gotten your petroleum engineering degree, don't give up on that degree. There is opportunity out there. There are still internships happening across the industry. There are still ways to stay involved, even if you can't find a job immediately. It's going to be tough right now. I'm not going to lie. It's going to be tough to get a job in the energy industry at the moment. but it doesn't mean they're not out there. And if you can embrace that, so if you're coming out of college right now, your capacity for technology is way higher than the people who have been in this industry 20 plus years. You are going to be able to do more from a technology standpoint than anyone else in the industry. So you have a benefit there to embrace this digital transformation and the energy transformation and be a part of that. You might just have to look in the areas of the industry that are still growing, which is in technology and in carbon capture and anything that's around alternative energy. So you might just have to shift your focus a little bit. But there are still opportunities out there. You just have to look a little harder.
Yeah, to comment on that, we have comment on chat that geothermal energy currently has a huge recruitment effort for professionals to pivot from oil and gas. I know that offshore wind energy, it's also growing, so there are certainly opportunities. Question from Tarek. How do you manage authenticity in challenging times like this?
I think the more authentic you can be, the better. That goes back to emotional intelligence, Tarek. You have to be authentic if you have emotional intelligence. You can't help it. But it also means you have to be a little vulnerable. You might not always know the answer. And you have to be okay saying, I don't know the answer. Let me go back and get it for you. So I think you can manage authenticity. You don't have to be the person who is strong all the time to lead. In fact, many times if you are the one to say, I know this is scary, scares me too, but we're going to get through it together, that's being authentic. It's not weakness. It's a strength to be authentic. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, a question from Dr. Jim. Could you give examples of a deal breaker in recruitment? You know, what's really...
So there's multiple layers to get through in an executive search. And Lauren can probably back me up on this. She's one of our directors here. If you treat the person who approaches you, who's probably, bottom of the totem pole, right? Lower level in the organization. If you treat them badly, that will be a deal breaker. If you treat them with disrespect, it will be a deal breaker. That's your first level. That's the first gate, right? So right up front, that's a deal breaker. If you, let's see, what are some others? I think anytime you just act unprofessionally, it is. One that's not necessarily a deal breaker, but can be depending on the client, is if you go around a recruiter to talk to the hiring manager. And the hiring manager hired the recruiter for a reason, because they didn't want to have to deal with all of that. And so they're not going to like it. The recruiter's not going to like it because you're bypassing the process. Now, those are with an executive search deal breakers. With clients, deal breakers are, again, going to be, how do you treat everyone in the process, whether that's inside the organization or out? If you are rude, or basically if you're not exhibiting emotional intelligence, it could rule you out pretty quickly, regardless of how much experience and success you've had. My suggestion, so it's hard to say breaker because it's different for every client. Every client has a different deal breaker. It might be, for some, it just might be you have to have a degree. For others, it might be that you have to have a very specific skill set in what they do. So it's all a little bit different. My suggestion is that you're always authentic and that you are always yourself, right? Don't try to be something else. Don't try to exhibit something that you think is needed. Be yourself and be who you are, but also don't be afraid to showcase your talents and your strengths, because I do have candidates who aren't good at talking about themselves or their successes, and they will sometimes not get the job when really they could do an amazing job. They just aren't comfortable selling themselves.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay. Question from Paul. I found difficult to be considered for position in my recent job search. That my experience is not really specific to the job industry I was applying for. I personally have a very broad experience in sales and business development, but not necessarily in the industry I was applying for. How, if even possible, I can modify my resume to be able to make the industry change?
So I think you have to, so there's two things I want to talk about here. So one, I think you have to find the common ground between those industries and the common ground in the roles. What is it that makes you successful in this industry, and how can that be translated to the new industry? And being able to show that. I will tell you, commercial acumen, business development roles, we're doing more of those through COVID than any other time. Well, they're always popular, but we're definitely getting more of them right now. So I think that's interesting. But I would say, look at where's the overlap? Where are you successful and how does it apply to the new industry? The other thing I'm going to tell you though, as you're searching for a job, this is in general, not just for sales roles, but if you're utilizing LinkedIn, which is an incredible tool for finding a job, and you see a job that you want to apply for, before you apply for that job, see what company it's with and look through your network on LinkedIn, and who do you know who can make a referral to someone in that company versus you just applying blindly online. If you can get a referral, you are much more likely to get an interview than if you just apply blind. And most people want to help you. So don't be afraid to ask your connections on LinkedIn for a referral. Worst case, they say no, and you're in the same place you were anyway. Best case is they say yes, and you get an interview. So don't be afraid to utilize your network on LinkedIn.
Okay. Any more questions? I can see one from Tarek actually. How well oil and gas industry is able to attract millennials compared to others?
So this is, Tarek, something that's been happening over the last 5 years. It's a good question. Funny enough, and maybe you guys have seen this at your level as well, but when I started recruiting in oil and gas in 2006, if I didn't get someone on the telephone, I was apologizing for sending an email. Now I have people who want to use WhatsApp. Text is very, very common, and not just text, but text with all the text words, right? A U instead of YOU, and all of that from executives. There's so many different ways to connect. I get lots of messages on LinkedIn. I get things on iMessenger, and millennials use all of that social media, different ways of communicating. I haven't seen anyone recruiting on Snapchat yet, and I hope that never ever happens. But that old technology wave, that's how they're doing it. So now there's companies who are trying to attract millennials, and is it the Z generation? I'm not exactly sure. That's my youngest daughter's in that generation. And they do all their applications on their telephones. They are doing video interviews on their telephone. Everything's happening through their telephone. And companies are finding ways to attract that. I've seen things on Facebook that get millennials to apply on their phone, and then they start sending them automated responses to set up interviews. It's it's a very different world. And I be honest to say, I'm not in that world. What I can say we've done in terms of leadership is we've been doing video interviews for years. Lauren and I work globally. And while the best case scenario for us is to see someone face to face, many times we don't always have that luxury and we have to use video conference. To me, that's still better than a telephone call. And it's gotten better and better over the years where you don't have as much disruption. You can actually see someone's eyes and their mannerisms. Still a little limiting, but for us, it wasn't a big struggle to move to a remote environment because we'd already been doing it in a lot of cases anyway. So that's been interesting. Great.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mary. I think we can stop here with questions. I would like to thank you again for the excellent talk. Thank you all everyone for the questions. Make sure to follow us up on LinkedIn and stay tuned for next editions.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. And it's been a pleasure to talk to all of you. Thank you very much.